has totally disappeared, but it has declined to a very great extent. The anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish movements that we see are the Muslim movements, and the French government has a responsibility to protect the Jews who are French citizens.
There were also pro-Israel protests throughout the world, one which took place yesterday in London. I want to go now to our I24 News correspondent, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, you were at the protest yesterday in London. Can you give us some numbers and, of course, what was the sentiment among the protesters there?
Some of the estimates I heard, speaking to the police who were present, were about up to 5,000 have estimated to have been there outside the Israeli embassy in Kensington in London, which is actually a huge number considering how these things usually go, and considering this is definitely a minority opinion among the protesting class, let's say. We saw the large turnouts for the protests that were taking place against Israel's actions, but to see these people gathered in the same place on a different day gave us a different insight into how some people see the conflict. And this crowd was altogether different in its behavior as well. There was mostly quiet, some singing of songs of solidarity with Israel, and a lot of flag waving. There were literally no offensive banners calling for the death of anyone. There were no Nazi chants and no bloodthirsty cries heard. In general, it was a very well-mannered show of solidarity, which many who were observing it said really shows the difference between those two groups. And the irony being that the so-called pro-peace protests are the ones which tend to result in violence. And in fact, the only violence that took place at this pro-Israel rally that happened yesterday was one attendee of the rally ended up being beaten somehow by some sort of counter-protest on the fringes, and he was treated by ambulance men on the scene, photos of which made it out as well shortly after the protest or rally dispersed.
And how many of the 5,000 that did show up, what kind of profile would you give them? Was it mainly Jewish groups, British Jews living in London? Were there other parts of British society showing solidarity with Israel? Because as you said, the numbers are starkly different. We have tens of thousands over the weekend in favor of pro-Palestinian and 5,000 pro-Israel.
I would say that the majority of the people there were probably from Britain's Jewish community, but there was also a very noticeable presence from those who weren't, because I think that support of Israel from outside the Jewish community is still somewhat notable at times like this. There were Christians there and Muslims there as well who don't support the anti-Israel protesting going on, and many of whom do support what Israel is doing to defend itself in the Gaza Strip from Hamas rockets and tunnels and the terror organization. But I would say that usually these groups are made up predominantly of the Jewish community, who mobilize most at times of strain for Israel. It is worth saying that, as Marie said from France, your correspondent there is something interesting about even the anti-Israel protests. They don't really necessarily represent the mainstream of British society. In fact, here they are also led and made up by the absolute far left, including the Socialist Workers' Party, whose banners you can see present. They actually print the banners up with their name and their logo on it, and various Islamist organizations, which also don't necessarily represent mainstream Muslim opinion. However, they mobilize large numbers at times like this, and when the far left and the extreme Islamists take to the street, it has a big impact visually, because you can see those huge crowds and people assume that that is more of a mainstream opinion than maybe it actually is.
And has the British government spoken out against any of these protests, or looking at, of course, their neighbors in Paris, saying this could be us in just maybe a couple of days, weeks, months?
They don't seem to have addressed the protests directly, as is pretty normal, but the Prime Minister did speak to Benjamin Netanyahu just 2 days ago about the situation in Israel and Gaza, and he noted the ongoing rocket attacks from Hamas were carrying on, and he reiterated the UK's strong support for Israel's right to take action and what he called proportionate action to defend itself from them. And the Prime Minister also expressed his condolences for the deaths of the troops and concern about the mounting civilian casualties in Gaza, and said that he asked Prime Minister Netanyahu to do all that he could to stop a spiral of violence from both sides and to try to resume the type of ceasefire that we saw put forward by Egypt. So there's no mention of condemnation, particularly of Israel. In fact, saying the opposite, that he recognized its right to self-defense and he supported its defensive action. But great concern for those deaths coming out of Gaza, and a huge urging of Israel and Hamas to work on the negotiations to achieve a ceasefire according to the Egyptian parameters that has been put forward, of course, which Israel already accepted and Hamas already rejected, but still continued pressure for that to be the aim at the moment.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, our i24 News correspondent there in London, thank you for that update. General Adato, of course, we look at the picture